Okay.
Okay. Hopefully I'm better now. I'll let Scott do the introductions here. I have one just one little bookkeeping item. Chad, I just noticed that your PDF has these wonderful block prints in it. And one of them would be perfect for my advertising for next week's class. Would I get in great trouble if I copied it from your PDF?
No, you would not.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a young artist from Missouri who did those in response to the Sabbath Economics book. It's we really like her work.
Cool. Okay, so I think it's time to get started. Scott, do you want to introduce?
I wasn't really prepared to do that, but I
Well,
say a couple of words,
you know him better than any of us do. So
yeah, just Ched was kind enough to come to Ashland First Presbyterian Church probably in the early 2000s. And he came to Presbytery. I think he did the whole summer conference once. Oh gosh, was that the early 90s? Probably. 5 days holding forth about the Bible and what it has to say about economic justice. So he got on Cascade's dance card big time then. He was hardly out of seminary when he wrote a commentary on the Book of Mark, which I'm pretty sure is still in print, right, Ched?
It is, yeah.
That's remarkable. I mean, that really says something right there. Binding the Strong Man, wasn't that it? And then he's still the principal face, or no, you co-lead the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, don't you?
Correct.
And I'll let you say something about that. So I'll get out of the way.
Great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to talk for 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for some back and forth. So I'm glad to be among you. Thank you to Dan and Scott for the invitation and for curating this little study group. These things matter in our day and time. Appreciate the fact that at least some of you have been reading our little biblical vision of Sabbath economics pamphlet. That pamphlet is now over 20 years old. We've been selling it all over the world as a popular little pamphlet. So thanks for having a look at that. If you haven't had a look at that, that's all right. I'm gonna try to give a coherent core sample of a Sabbath economics approach to scripture. I'm actually going to work with a text that is not in that booklet to try to expand the field. I think how I want to start here, though, is to say where I'm beaming in from, which is the little town of Oakview, halfway up the Ventura River watershed in Southern California. This is the heart of traditional and unceded and untreated Chumash territory, the first peoples of our bioregion. And here we curate Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, a small nonprofit organization that for the last 25 years has sought to nurture courage, conviction, and capacity for church renewal through education, advocacy, and organizing. Friends, we are approaching the season of the saints at the end of this month, All Hallows Eve, All Saints, All Souls, Dia de los Muertos. And in this season, I want to dedicate my comments tonight to an amazing Presbyterian woman, activist, theologian, saint, in my opinion, because we're also next week commemorating the second anniversary of her passing. Some of you may know or know of Reverend Murphy Davis, Presbyterian minister. She was part of the Open Door community in Atlanta, Georgia, which served the homeless community in Atlanta, and also was a real linchpin in the anti-death penalty work in the state of Georgia. And Murphy was beloved and renowned for her work on both fronts. She also fought very aggressive cancer for more than 20 years and was able to articulate how our medical system often is a principality and a power, particularly when it comes to poor folk. So thinking of Murphy Davis in this beautiful portrait here in the great series Americans Who Tell the Truth. And I do want to commend her book that was published posthumously, Surely Goodness and Mercy, in which she talks about the journey, her journey through the Valley of Death for more than 2 decades while doing this other service and advocacy work. So Murphy Davis presente. Well, we're approaching the midterms, and obviously, as you all are well aware, and I'm sure have talked about in the course of this study group, the social fabric of our civil society is under great strain. We can talk about all kinds of divides that we all navigate: racial, social, economic. Now, here in California's earthquake country, we would call these fault lines.
Yeah.
I think that's an appropriate term because faults are the result of powerful tectonic forces that relentlessly grind on the very ground on which we stand. So here at BCM, we think it's an apt synonym for the widening racial, economic, and ideological divides around us and under us. These fault lines are cracks in the crust of our traditional civic covenants. You know, faults move slowly and imperceptibly until their pent-up energy is suddenly released in violent paroxysms that shake everything, right? Earthquakes, and reveal how fragile that crust actually is, such as the January 6th, 2021 insurrection, or any number of civil uprisings, which both your urban areas in Oregon and certainly ours in Southern California have experienced over the last few decades. In our Sabbath economics work, we focus on the fault lines of economic inequality. These fault lines have been growing for a long time, as you see in the graph here. But in the last quarter century, economic disparity has become acute, and it continues to intensify, with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. This is largely due, in my opinion, to the dynamics and power of the modern market culture, which I like to imagine through the lens of this cartoon, which really captures the manic depressive pendulum of market culture, which really is today the modern, the primary narrative of our age, the primary mythos of our age. I love this image because it pictures our historical momentum as an out of control vehicle. That's itself a poignant image in our car addicted culture, which is driving the carbon economy and driving climate catastrophe. We're in a car that we think we're driving, but is probably driving us. And it is hurtling toward both ecological and social catastrophe. And I draw your attention to the dude over in the bottom right-hand corner. I hope you can see that he's on his cell phone calling in the emergency, but really not knowing who is he dialing. We might think of him as a symbol of the church in our historical era. The look on his face suggests that he feels caught, uncertain, maybe powerless to respond to this vehicle racing toward a cliff-like fault line. And I know that many of us feel like that, both personally and politically, not least as we drive toward the midterms that are coming up. Now, we talk a lot in our Sabbath economics work about a major plot line of the Bible being Sabbath economics, and the way to capture the plot, if you will, of Sabbath economics is to understand it in terms of the struggle, the archetypal struggle between two economies. The economy biblically that we might call mammon, and that we might call manna. And hopefully you've done enough exploration into the Sabbath economics material so that these terms are at least familiar to you. I'm not going to recite the work around both mammon and mamma that appears in the booklet, but what I do want to do is, in order to help us understand these admittedly ancient terms, to turn to somebody like Ferdinand Tönnies. Now, I don't know if he's familiar to you. Tönnies was one of the most famous sociologists of the late 19th century, the era of Max Weber and Karl Marx. Tönnies' father was of Frisian ancestry in the Low Countries, was a successful farmer and rancher and a leader in the Lutheran Church. And Tönnies' mother came from a long line of Lutheran ministers. Interestingly, Tönnies himself was the only social scholar of his generation at the end of the 19th century who came from the countryside. And this gave him a critical view of the relentless march of urban industrial capitalism during the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. Tönnies observed families being swallowed up into factory culture as people migrated from the countryside to the cities. Factory culture in which men, women, and even children suffered from low pay, excessive work hours, and terrible living conditions. These are still issues today. So Ferdinand Tönnies' way of articulating the dilemma he saw shaping up at the close of the 19th century, what I'm calling the gulf between mammon and manna culture, his way of describing it is, I think, instructive. In 1887, he wrote a book that made a basic distinction between two powerful fundamental forces. One he called the integrating power of traditional Gemeinschaft, or community, such as kinship, ethnicity, religion, even locality. And the other he called the disintegrating instrumentalist forces of Gesellschaft, capitalist society, which was characterized by mobility, urbanization, worker exploitation, resource extraction, racial hierarchy, secularism, and above all, the primacy of capital. So Tönnies defined Gemeinschaft very succinctly. He called it everything that holds human relationships together despite all that is pulling them apart. Just think about that for a minute. And he defined Gesellschaft in turn as everything that pulls human relationships apart despite all that holds them together. So he saw how the modern market economy and the state apparati that were being developed in the late 19th century to facilitate the market economy, these things were steadily unraveling the fabric of older, more traditional ways of economic exchange, which were fundamentally relational, right? You kind of knew the person you were buying stuff from. And in the process, plundering the commonwealth of Earth and of the human community. It's notable that Tönnies' work is still in print today. It is considered to be a kind of a third way sociological analysis between the communism of Marx and the liberalism of Weber. Those to remain, of course, the two dominant streams in both sociology and politics today. It's little wonder then that early in his career, Tönnies was ousted from the university by Prussian authorities in Germany, and at the end of his career, ousted again by Nazi authorities. But I find his way of articulating the dilemma of modernity to be revealing, and it certainly helps make sense of the stories that Jesus tells, including the one that we'll look at tonight. In Isaiah 58, we're called to be repairers of the breach, and that can be intimidating. We're just regular folk trying to navigate these fault lines around us. What can we do to change the powerful forces at play? In the midst of all the conflicts that we experience these days, the church has often appealed to the discourse of reconciliation. We've got to help folk learn how to talk with each other and be civil. But unfortunately, this discourse is often sentimentalized. In my partner Elaine and I 2-volume project entitled Ambassadors of Reconciliation, we explore at length the Apostle Paul's argument for reconciliation, most famously in 2 Corinthians 5 and 6, a text which, by the way, came up this year in the 4th Sunday of Lent in our lectionary. Paul asserts that reconciliation is indeed our core vocation as Christians. God has given us the ministry of reconciliation, entrusting the message to us. Apostle Paul uses vocabulary here that is all about equity. The semantic field of the verb to reconcile, in Greek katalasso, used only by Paul in the New Testament, is economic, not expiatory. In Aristotle, for example, it connotes an exchange of money to establish equivalence of value. We still, in fact, in our language, still speak of reconciling a bank statement. This economic discourse of reconciliation resonates with the Hebrew Bible tradition of Sabbath and Jubilee, which we explore in our Sabbath economics booklet. For example, the unilateral 7th or 49th year release from debt bondage is precisely the meaning of God's decision not to count our trespasses against us. Christ heralds the renewal of this divine economy of grace. The old debt system is passing away. To reconcile is, in other words, to restore equity. Now, we're speaking on the eve of the great Jewish feast of Simchat Torah, in which the community celebrates the centrality of the Torah and Haftorah, the Hebrew Bible, to its existence. And as a Christian, it's my favorite Jewish feast. It teaches us respect and fidelity to the ancient wisdom of our scriptures. And that's why so often I like to use these texts to try to look at contemporary issues. Moreover, Paul makes it clear that in order to participate in this divine jubilee, we must embrace a ministry of reconciliation. And that's not a soundbite, that's a verb. Which brings me to the text I want to work with you tonight, which will come up in the lectionary in 2 weeks, a week from Sunday, on October 30th. And that, my friends, is scary because it is the story of Zacchaeus. This text is relevant because inequality is actually not a natural condition, as we argue in the Sabbath economics book, but a social dis-ease. Some folks call it today the dis-ease of affluenza. So let's look for a minute at Luke's gospel. We've been in year C all this year, lectionary wise. And look with me for a minute at Luke's middle section, sometimes called Luke's special section, because it's all Lucan material exclusively. You don't find it in the other Gospels. And this pretty impressive series is rather relentless, actually, which attempt to diagnose and confront the pathology of affluenza, particularly as it affects the rich, all throughout Luke 12 to 19, actually culminates with the text that I want to focus on today, and the text in 2 weeks in the lectionary, the story of Zacchaeus. And that, so it's the culminating story of this sequence, and it's got some surprises. So the Zacchaeus story is a doublet, actually, that puts the rich and the poor in uncomfortably close proximity. So we looked at the first doublet last month in the lectionary gospel story. I forgot to ask actually whether Southminster follows the Revised Common Lectionary, but I assume you do to some degree. So this came up last month in the infamous story of Lazarus and Dives in Luke 16, in which a rich man and poor man are twinned or contrasted quite starkly. Here in Luke 19, 18 and 19, we have another pairing, a blind poor man who is outside the gates of Jericho, and the rich man Zacchaeus, who is firmly ensconced at the center of the world in Jericho. Luke often will do this kind of twinning into social archetypes, and in order for us to appreciate that, I want to appeal a contemporary political cartoon. This is from a U.S. newspaper in the mid 1990s. Pictures two people sitting on a sidewalk in front of the White House, and I want you to just look at this for a minute and note that you really have two archetypes here, right? And you can tell that by their costume, by their countenance, and by their messaging. One is dressed shabbily, is downcast, holds it silent. There's a sign reading, starving and alone. The other one, sitting next to him, wears a suit, is happily smiling. His cup is overflowing with money. He's proud what a great country it is, while his sign reads, savings and loan. Right, so just, I think all of you are old enough to remember in the 1990s, several federal bailouts ago, in which banks that had gone bankrupt because of bad investments were bailed out by the federal government. Thousands of Americans lost their home, but the banks prospered thanks to a government bailout. 15 years later, of course, this happened again, only much more dramatically. And some would argue it's happening again now with the most recent real estate bubble. From the point of view of this political cartoon, bankers got rich while the homeless poor grew poorer. I use this example because we can interpret immediately the meaning of this sophisticated symbolic narrative, can we not? Because it's a type of storytelling from our culture. We are insiders to this discourse. We might not be so quick to recognize Luke's political cartoon because it's from a time and space far removed from ours, but the symbols are most definitely there. Now, we don't have time tonight to focus on the episode, the first episode of this dyad, which is Jesus lifting up the poor, disabled blind man. But I do want to point out that both stories in this dyad occur in proximity to the city of Jericho, and that this twinning juxtaposes tightly stories in which a poor man and a rich man are both granted vision, and in which they both make decisions to follow Jesus' way. In the process, there's a certain leveling of the playing field. The blind beggar is lifted up and recognized for his full humanity by Jesus, while the rich man is literally brought down from his perch high above the crowds. I'd go so far as to say that this is a dramatic enactment of that revolutionary lullaby called the Magnificat back at the beginning of Luke's gospel narrative. So at the end of this Lucan sequence of poor and rich, both persons will stand on level ground as a reunited family, sharing the gifts of God equitably. So let's look at the Zacchaeus story in a little bit of detail, because you'll hear it in worship in 2 weeks. And when you do, perhaps you'll recall this study group. We Christians need to explore a radical analysis that probes the roots of our collective dis-ease so that we can be about healing. I believe that going to the roots of our faith, especially the old wisdom of Scripture, can animate our theological and political imaginations as church in order to embrace a discipleship of healing and repair of these fault lines that are killing people even as we speak. Now, in our churches, Zacchaeus gets portrayed as a fat little man with no particular social identity who climbed a tree to see Jesus. I believe there's even a Sunday school story about him. Can anybody sing it? Go ahead. Some of you have been in church long enough to know this tune.
Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. I don't remember all the words, but yeah.
That's it. That's the one, Diane.
That sycamore tree.
There you go.
Something for to see.
That's right. Right. So this is one of the many ways in which we dumb down and sentimentalize stories that actually have considerable bite to them. And this kind of little Sunday school tune, which of course sticks in one's heads decades and decades later, obscures the real economic terrain of the first century. The tax collectors referred to in the New Testament were local Jews who were employed by the colonial occupiers to do something called tax farming. In this system, the tax farmer paid Rome money in advance and then had to make this up by exacting commissions on taxes, tolls, and customs on land, products, and persons. Since the regular people had no idea what sort of financial arrangement had been negotiated by the tax collector, they were at the mercy of whatever he charged. Due to their extortion as agents of Rome, tax collectors were socially rejected, religiously excommunicated, and politically viewed as traitors. Not well liked. Because their profits flowed up the hierarchical ladder, the richest tax collector would have been the one at the top of the pyramid, the chief tax collector. That would be Zacchaeus. He would have been the most rapacious, the most despised, and would have hardly been perceived by a peasant audience as hearing this story as an innocent and jolly little character. As a political and economic structure that strategically advantaged certain people over others, this ancient tax system was not in kind different than our modern systems that benefit the few and exploit the many. Zacchaeus' headquarters were in Jericho, a great center for trade as the port of all entry for all traffic crossing the Judean frontier and the River Jordan from the east. So the beggar and Zacchaeus were each strategically situated in relationship to a powerful place, and they represented the top and bottom of the social pyramid. You see the political cartoon. Now, was Zacchaeus short of stature or young in age? The Greek term helikia is translated in every other usage in the New Testament or the Septuagint or the Papyri as young. And so we can probably think of Zach as someone who inherited his lofty position as the result of family patronage, probably to the royal house of Herod, who kept their winter palace in Jericho. So Zach's privilege contrasts sharply with the unnamed blind man, who had endured years of marginalization and invisibility. But this is a story full of surprises, the first of which is that we're told that this universally scorned representative of an oppressive system of occupation was actually trying to see Jesus. Here's the first connection Luke makes between him and the poor man. They both want to see. and they're both blind, though in different ways. In this fashion, Luke binds the fate of these two characters tightly together, though they inhabit opposite ends of the social spectrum. Impossible to bridge the gulf between these two, you think? The rich and powerful will never give up power. Well, here's where little narrative details matter. The kind of tree Zach was sitting in was a sycamorea, a mulberry tree. And what did Jesus have to say earlier in Luke about such trees? If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this sycamino, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. You see, Jesus believed that another economic order was possible and indeed imperative. And so here he challenges someone high up in that very tree to do something impossible. Incidentally, the oppressive economy of the Roman Empire into the sea in the book of Revelation, just saying. Sure enough, here Zacchaeus will end up uprooted and replanted into the soil of Sabbath economics. Now comes more surprising twists in the story. Summoning Zacchaeus to come down from his lofty position, Jesus invites himself over to his place for dinner. An aggressive and perhaps risky strategy. But despite having been pretty hard on rich people in his teaching thus far in Luke's gospel, and having just seen his call to discipleship summarily rejected by a rich man a few episodes earlier in Luke 18, Jesus nevertheless takes initiative, essentially inviting himself in, insisting that Zach be in relationship with folks he has long ignored. And this story has particular bite if we relatively affluent, secure North Americans put ourselves in his shoes. But this surprise is immediately followed by another. Zach hurries down and welcomes Jesus joyfully. This is indeed unexpected and bold and even courageous pivot for someone of Zach's social standing. After all, he lives in the insular bubble of the wealthy, and surely it is evident to him that by welcoming this homeless man, Jesus, he also will be welcoming Jesus' entourage, which specifically now includes the poor blind man of the previous story. Imagine this group of folk trooping into Zach's beautiful, elegant home or into our suburban churches. I'm thinking there were tensions. The characters in the story are indeed unsettled by this awkward class mixing. There is immediate resistance from both Jesus and Zach's people. The former object to sharing table fellowship with an oppressor. The latter are no doubt worrying about the fine china and the silverware. Apparently, Zach can sense the tension. Read carefully now. Luke tells us that he stood still. Here's a second connection to the previous story. It's the same exact phrase that described what Jesus did when he heard the blind man screaming at him. Jesus stopped, took the time to feel and hear the cry of the marginalized, as opposed to just walking by. Well, it must have been Zacchaeus who stops dead in his track. I believe Luke uses this sort of rhetorical linking and repetition to suggest that Zacchaeus is encountering not only Jesus, but poor people as well. He is seeing them likely for the first time, which leads to the second step of his liberation. In that Zen moment of pause, Zacchaeus seems to realize that Jesus is interested in more than just hospitality. He's interested in relationship, which leads to a stunning turn of events and of heart. Zacchaeus offers unbidden two ways in which he might take what we call responsibility. He doesn't issue a public lament about inequality or ritual apology in front of the press. He doesn't issue a call for a committee to study the problem, not a summoning of the chair of the charity fund, not a rant about government policy. No, Zacchaeus commits to redistributing redistributing half of his huparkonton, a word that means property, friends, not just money. Zach's action here is not charity. It is distribution, according to the teaching of Torah. Exodus 22 says that someone who has stolen from another must restore equity and then some, 4 or 5-fold, in order to make up for the breach of trust and aggravation. So Zacchaeus is essentially copping to the fact that his wealth is stolen from others, and he is obeying Torah and then some. Leviticus, in turn, asserts that defrauding someone requires restitution of what was taken, plus 20%, a principle that is adjudicated through rituals of accountability. Zach indeed entertains the prospect that he may have defrauded some folk, or maybe he's just quoting Leviticus, at which point we can imagine Jesus raising an eyebrow and saying, "If you have defrauded?" And yet Zacchaeus goes well beyond Torah's 20%. In other words, he's not just making restitution, friends, he's making reparations. This is the true indicator of conversion. And needless to say, it stands in stark contrast to every other one of Luke's portraits of rich men in his gospel narrative. The only explanation of this dramatic initiative suggested by Luke's story arc is that Zacchaeus must have received intelligence, he is, after all, chief tax czar, from his underling in Capernaum, that this prophet from Nazareth was serious about actual redistribution of wealth to those on the other side of the socioeconomic divide. Back in Luke 5, a certain Levi responded to Jesus' discipleship call not only by abandoning his tax office, but by inviting the prophet to his home for a feast, which Luke describes as Jubilee hospitality. Back in chapter 5, debtors and debt collectors sharing table fellowship. There too, objections were raised. The table was a primary determiner of social relations in antiquity, and such dramatic boundary crossing would threaten the status quo. How Jesus responds there is instructive. You can't heal people, he says, who don't know they're sick. Only those who acknowledge the dis-ease. Jesus can't do much for those who fancy themselves pious or woke, or those who don't think there are any problems with the status quo. But Jesus can build a movement with those who commit to the hard, lifelong work of turning personal and political history around, which is the meaning, as you know, of the word repentance. So Zach has joined this movement. In response to all of this, in Luke 19, Jesus makes an extraordinary threefold response to Zach's commitment to reparations. First, he declares that today salvation or liberation has come to this house. He means this quite literally. After all, Jesus and all his funky friends have crossed that huge gulf, that fault line, into Zach's home. In so doing, bringing his liberation. It is the encounter that brings transformation. Secondly, by calling Zacchaeus a son of Abraham, Jesus has restored his severed membership in his people. This is another way of linking Zach's fate to the nation, but also to the poor of that nation. Back in Luke 13:16, you might remember that Jesus healed a bent-over woman whose condition some commentators believe was symbolic of someone crippled by the unpayable burden of debt. And there, Jesus similarly named her a daughter of Abraham. This too rankled the authorities, but Jesus was clear that both the poorest debtor and the richest creditor have to be healed for the Abrahamic family to truly be made whole. for the beloved community to be restored. Yeah, that's the same Abraham, by the way, who was rocking Lazarus in his bosom in Luke 16, and who keeps directing Divis's attention to those fault lines between rich and poor. The third thing Jesus says is to remind us that the tax collectors are unequivocally lost unless and until they repent, which very concretely means redistributive reparation. The bent over woman and the blind beggar were dehumanized by economic disparity and were made whole in economic as well as physical terms. But this chief tax collector is lost, hopelessly addicted to privilege and power unless and until he restores equity. As Wendell Berry put it, the great obstacle is simply this: the conviction that we cannot change because we are dependent on what is wrong. But that is the addict's excuse, and we know it will not do. So at the culmination of Luke's sprawling narrative about rich people in his gospel, Jesus accompanies Zach to take step one in the parlance of the 12-step movement, the portal to all recovery and healing. To conduct a searching moral inventory, to know there is a greater power, to make amends, and to make reparations. So what have we learned from this gospel text, which will come at us like a hurtling market economy vehicle 2 weeks from today? Well, I think we've learned that Jesus pays attention to the poor. He animates their empowerment. Your faith has liberated you, he says to the blind beggar who follows. And that he invites the powerful to change and to execute concrete justice. You too are a son of Abraham, he says to Zacchaeus. And that is, he is realistic about the consequences of resisting the mammon system, which is why Bonhoeffer called discipleship costly. That story, by the way, is told in the episode that immediately follows that of Zacchaeus in Luke's gospel, called the parable of the pounds. The whole sequence exhibits, once again, the personal and political struggle between mammon and manna. And it shows that Sabbath economics is a vision of healing for everyone. But for those of us who have a leg up in that Jericho tree, who have too much, as we do, who have benefited materially from settler colonialism as we have, who continue to enjoy white privilege as we do, our dis-ease will ultimately only be healed by making concrete redistributions of wealth, power, mobility, and access. I know that the purpose of your study group is to talk about how we do these things, but it's very important to be motivated by greater than ourselves. And these stories are stories like that. But I like to end with this image of money, since we're talking about money. To be precise, we're talking about small change. But friends, real change is made up of innumerable local expressions of changed thinking and changed practices. No personal, congregational, or denominational step is too small. But given what we're dealing with, none of our steps are too big either. So I want to end there, and we've got maybe 10 or 15 minutes left. We started a little bit late to hear maybe your responses to the story, or maybe you want to jump right into questions about how we go about this work. I'm happy to talk about that. We're an intimate little group of a dozen. I read somewhere that movements were started out of groups by groups of that size. So if you want to either chat in your questions. I see that that hasn't happened yet, or just unmute yourself and make a brief comment or a question. The floor is open. What shimmers for you? What is resonating with you? What troubles you? That's probably more like it. This is one of what some feminist scholars called a text of terror to folks of privilege, like most of us.
Judy, did you have something?
I was just going to share the rather unusual background for me just before I zoomed in here, and now we had a little crisis in our family today because our taxes were due. These are our federal and state taxes that we had a CPA working on, and he wasn't communicating with us. But anyway, I had been bugging the accountant to give us our returns so that I could get them turned in on time. Well, first of all, most people that have enough money to hire an accountant also have enough money to extend their tax time. Anyway, the joke is on us. We had to come up with way more money than we've ever seen before. And so I just took the checks down, and we robbed the banks that we had, and I just took the checks down to the post office. And then I thought, and I was late checking in, and I thought, well, sweet justice. This is a privileged person getting a reminder to redistribute it.
And of course, those are redistributions that are modest by any account and are also built into the system that nurtures disparity among us, particularly the tax system. So let's talk about going beyond that. And I'm interested not so much in what you're already doing, but what you think the next step might be for you when you think about the story of Zacchaeus and what it impresses upon you and your household economics, as we say in the Sabbath Economics booklet. What might be a next step that you're thinking about, or that you're mulling over, or that you're afraid of?
You're asking me?
I'm asking anyone.
Anybody?
Yeah.
I'll continue. I'll answer and then I'll be quiet. My husband and I just redid our wills and gave it all away to somebody else.
That's a step that you're hoping to take.
Yes.
Posthumously. Okay, that's
yes, and maybe we should do it now.
well, that's right. No step is too small, no step is too great. That's great, Judy. Thank you. Who else wants to step into the quicksand of the Zacchaeus story? Di? You'll have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Sorry, I don't know. You'd think I'd never been on Zoom before. I had so much trouble. I am interested in people's reactions to and thoughts about the current conversation about reparations, meaning, and by that I mean reparations to the descendants of enslaved people. I mean, that's exactly what reparations are to me. A couple of years ago, maybe only a year ago, someone very beloved to me, who is a very devout Christian man, sort of threw the word reparations out like, what a ridiculous thing to even think about. Like, whoever thought of something so stupid?
Yeah.
And I was stunned that he would just cast off the idea of reparations, or maybe he wasn't thinking of reparation. Well, he was. So I'm interested in hearing, what are the experiences of people in this group? What have we all heard our friends and neighbors and acquaintances say in terms of reparations? What is the mood? I mean, I haven't talked with anybody else in my close circle.
Well, this is a good circle to talk to. And while y'all are thinking about that great question, let me just say that there are two very broad and very deep movements in this country around reparations. One is for reparations for the descendants of the slavery system, and the other is for reparations for the descendants of indigenous communities.
Exactly.
And both are very strong. Both are very relevant to Oregon as well as California, as well as every other state. And there's lots of work being done around that. It is also true that our churches have scarcely scratched the surface of this, because most of our churches have embraced not the gospel of our scriptures, but the gospel of capitalism. And reparations is high heresy in the gospel of capitalism. However, as we've hopefully seen tonight, it's right there at the heart of our gospel. So what do y'all think about Di's question? Have you given it some thought? Are you encountering it in people and movements in social media?
I'll just throw out there that I see it as reparations is maybe the wrong place to start the discussion. I think we're just kind of trying to almost just get started on a discussion in this country about what really happened and what our history really was, and try to get people to acknowledge that. And I think that is just that has been the uphill struggle, because our national conversation about race seems to be, oh yeah, we used to be racist, but we fixed that, and we'll just go forward and just like not do any racial favoritism going forward. And anything that looks like reparations looks like racial favoritism to some people. And so therefore, you know, we just, it's reparations is related to affirmative action. It's related to the 1619 project. It's related to teaching CRT in our schools.
Yep.
I agree with that, Dan. And I'm sorry, but I do think in what I'm hearing, just, you know, in radio broadcasts that I listen to, I think that financial reparations are here and now in the national conversation. I think that the conversation now is way beyond, let's face the 1619 project. Let's really talk about what's right to do here and now. I just think we've quickly gone farther down that road than I would have imagined.
I think you're both right. Go ahead, Diane.
I was just going to say, this is something that my siblings and we get together on Zoom every other Sunday evening. And we've actually talked about this a number of times. And while we all believe it's the right thing to do, we don't really know how to go about it.
Right.
Well, if I may make a suggestion that kind of bridges all three of your comments. Elaine and I just published a book. If you open your chat, you'll see I've put it in the chat, a URL, you can find it. Our newest book is called Healing Haunted Histories, a Settler Discipleship of Decolonization. And it speaks to the question of how to face our history, how to face the present demands of justice, and how to take steps, both personal and political. This is, it's a paradigm shift for all of us, particularly those of us who have enjoyed race, class, and gender status. But there is a there, and it is not just percolating out in social movements. It is very much at the heart of our discipleship. So you might want to just check out this resource, and maybe your next study group, some of you might be interested in tackling it. It is important to face history. It is important to act now, and it is important to talk it through with our friends, family, and community. Anybody else want to respond to Di's challenge? Go ahead, Doug.
So I firmly believe in reparations, but I want to make very clear that it's not about money. It's about access to jobs. It's access to a community that's supportive of what you're about. It's ensuring that the schools have resources available all the way across the board. In the late 60s, I was involved in a committee for One Society at the Urban Training Center in Chicago. And our project was to show that Niebuhr's social gospel works today. The leader of our group had submitted a book and got turned back and said, I think you're in an ivory tower. And so the Committee for One Society in Chicago was trying to get the local YMCAs to fund inner city YMCA facilities. Mm-hmm. Right. They said, you're crazy. You're nuts. No, we're not going to do that. So the reparations is in how we change the whole of our society to be supportive of each other. It's not just money down the tubes.
But I think money is important. I think money has to be part of that because, I feel like we need to, as a society and as individuals, try to work towards more equitable distribution of resources, period. Money, land, everything. And so we need to look at the distribution of resources that we have. And then for those people like us, if we have more than our share, we need to give some back.
Yep. In our work, we talk about the sliding scale of starting with money, because that's often the thing that can be mobilized most quickly. And it's the thing that gets our attention as children of a capitalist society. Land is the next step deeper, much more challenging, but much more substantial. Institutions are the next level. Transforming institutions, as Doug is talking about, is the next level down. And then, of course, whole systems is the fourth level down, and really the substructure of everything. But it's good not to wait until it's all changed. It takes all the small changes that we need to make. Other comments or questions before we, go ahead, Pastor.
I'd just say that we in well-off suburban churches are awfully good at writing checks and feeling good about ourselves afterward, whether they're for reparations or the latest mission endeavor. We are much less inclined to roll up our sleeves and get in the mix with people personally. So while we say money is important, we need to recognize that we're awfully good at that. The whole business of community really means not being separated from those who, again, we are so good at having meetings over and writing checks, and then going on to the next thing that we're going to be part of.
I really want to commend to you a story and give you a little homework. This is one of the stories of reparation that we highlight in Healing Haunted Histories. And it's the story of a small Presbyterian church in New York State, Stony Point Presbyterian Church. which 5 years ago was looking at closing its doors, and went through an amazing process as a community in conversation with local Indigenous people. And today, Stony Point Presbyterian Church is now Sweetwater Cultural Center, and it is owned and operated by Indigenous folks. And it's an amazing story, which you might want to check out as both a financial, a land-based, and an institutional journey of transformation and redistribution, right in your own tradition. Stony Point Presbyterian Church, now Sweetwater Cultural Center.
Going to put in a quick plug. This is Family Promise Week, and one of the things that we ask people to do is spend one night without sleeping in your own bed. So either sleeping on the floor or a couch or in your car, just to put yourself in a situation that many, many millions of people face all the time.
And I also want to make a plug about our community garden spaces. As a person interested in food systems and food justice, I feel like as a church, we could do some really powerful things there, shaping maybe some, different systems or supporting some different systems in our communities. I know that I believe we lend some of that property to community gardens, but what if we did it more focused towards folks who want to be growing more of their own native foods and don't have space to do that? When I asked one of my colleagues about how can our really great supportive church affect change in food systems, she mentioned that as an idea, often space is just one of the greatest needs for folks wanting to grow things. And also things like, what if you helped pay the rent for some of the other, I believe in Beaverton, there's, some food, although we maybe can't become a food pantry ourselves, we could do things like this is kind of what I envisioned from what she told me. There's a refrigerator system set up, people can go just pick up food from it somewhere in Beaverton. It's like an open pantry. They need help with rent. I mean, those are things that as a church we could do. I don't find it particularly empowering to think of as an individual with my income or my family's income, how could I do something about these things? But our church has so many brains and resources and motivation that we already do a lot, and we could just be creative about doing more.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Some folks in the transition movement call that type of thinking moving from what is to what if. And your imagination, what if we did this? What if we did that? That's exactly how things begin to change. And I know there's a movement down in Metro Los Angeles of churches and synagogues to repurpose some of the lawn space or parking lot space into community gardens. And that is something that has been tried and something that some churches are doing. So it's about the communitizing of our imaginations and deprivatizing our anxieties, just talking together about these things. That's how we can move forward. I'm mindful of the time. I know you all are just go for an hour, so I will in a second turn it back over maybe to you, Dan. But before I do, I just want to make one advertisement. Well, I guess it'll be the second one after the book. But I do want to invite all of you to consider joining us at our Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute. Each year we hold it in February. Those are the dates for next year. We do it down here in the Ventura River watershed. And it is a community in which we try to move the conversation from what is to what if, and communitize our imaginations around a whole bunch of things, including Sabbath economics and reparations. So didn't want to leave you without making that, sharing that opportunity. And with that, Dan, I'll turn it back to you with thanks for the opportunity to be with you.
Okay, I think that we will say thank you to Chad, and then I'm gonna ask people to stick around for another 5 minutes or so as we talk about what we want to talk about next. So thank you so much, Chad. It was an enlightening evening, and we will hear. When was the last time you came to this area to speak live?
Not too long ago, a few years ago. It's
Okay.
been a while, but
we have had like real life, walking, talking speakers here,
Yeah,
and had
always.
some good luck with that. So we just
always better.
We will we will think about doing that in the future.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
His book that he just mentioned about settler discipleship is available on Kindle for $2.99 right now. It's quite expensive if you buy a hardback or something, but if I just went ahead and ordered it, I'll take a look at it, but I don't know how long it'll be that price, but it said lowest price in the last 30 days. So maybe it's been that price for the whole last 30 days, but.
Yeah.
Good, thanks for doing that. Doug, did you get to ask your question? Oh, you did, okay.
So our plan is to do this on the Monday evenings for a few more weeks, but to kind of move organically from where we've been to where we might want to go next. And so I'll take a moment to if anybody has any great desires about where to go next, and you can also email me and we'll figure it out. But so it seems to me the two main possibilities are to continue this discussion that Ched started this evening with something more about reparations. I was also prepared to go next week with one of the ideas that came up last week, because it's so timely to this upcoming election, would be to focus on housing and homelessness next week. So those are two thoughts. What are yours?
I have a thought about the homelessness one and also some others. Is would it make sense to do a little research on the political arguments that are going on in Portland area right now about, for example, homelessness? What kinds of positions are being suggested? What are some of the policies that are being debated, rather than just do it in a sort of generic spiritual, we should do this, we should do that, but to actually try to question the details of some of the proposals that are being suggested, like even just with the governor candidates, or the Washington County candidates, or something like that. Or we could say what's being suggested in the Portland area, what's being suggested in the rest of the state, or I don't know. I just feel like tying it more specifically to current proposals would make it more interesting.
That was exactly what I had in mind, was to look at a couple of Bible things real quickly, and then and various people do your own research and come up with articles and things that to share, and then somebody could have the homework assignment of going to the three candidates' websites and see if you can make any sense out of what their positions are on homelessness.
Well, the Oregonian, they did their endorsement today of Tina Kotek, and one of the things they were saying about her was one of the reasons that they were endorsing her was because she had a more fully developed idea about homelessness, which made me want to look into that more and find out what is that more fully developed idea. And then they were sort of saying that the others did not have quite as much. So I was curious about that. I mean, I'll certainly go ahead.
There's a debate on Wednesday night, I think at 7 o'clock, of the three governors. So that would be one way to get information on that topic.
Can I jump in for just a moment?
Sure.
And just say that last week, Janet asked us just that, most basic question of all, what is poverty? Isn't that what you said, Janet? And
Oh, yeah, that was good.
I think, talking about what homelessness is definitely in line with that. But before we go about helping anybody, it sure would be good to have a better idea of what poverty and homelessness is. So I'd be all up for doing our homework in that area, whether it's just homelessness or houselessness or what. I'm not sure yet.
Well, and it's not just the question of housing is not just homelessness either. It's how easy is it to own a house? How easy is it to rent a house? How easy is it to evict someone? Is housing a basic right in our society, or something that's only available to people who can afford it? It's a very broad question, really.
And if you want to do the thing on the homelessness, it might be easier if you make more specific assignments. I think the people running for the city council in Portland, it's a big issue as well. And there have been some very interesting differences. But if it's kind of just generic to look at all of them, it's a little overwhelming for me anyway. But if, I had kind of one person figure out what that person's position is, it might be a little easier to do.
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, I can put out an email to everybody who's here tonight and see some ideas of things that could be researched for next week, and see if people want to take them on. The only thing I can absolutely promise you is I'm not going to do all of that myself.
Why not?
But when it's kind of generic, just look into it. It's kind of,
Well, it's
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's county races in Portland and Multnomah. There's county races in Beaverton and Washington, and city and county races, and then there's the state race. And if somebody wanted to present a little bit about what's going on in each of those areas, that would be plenty for next week.
Would you follow up? I vote that you do what you just suggested, Dan, and that is not for you to do a whole bunch of work on it, but send an email so that we have a few minutes to think about it. And then we could answer all and basically sign up to research a particular candidate or a particular view. That way we won't get too hung up right now on talking about those things, and Dan won't have to do all the work.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you look into something and you go, well, these people are running for this office and both of their positions are so big as to be meaningless, and that's your whole report, then that's what we need to know. So I'm not sure how many of these candidates actually have useful proposals out there. We should be getting. Should we be getting voters pamphlets soon? I mean,
We have them.
No.
You have them?
Yes, they've already come out.
Okay.
Ballots are going out this week, I think.
I got my voter's pamphlet today.
We
Okay,
don't have
I
it.
did not, so I should get it tomorrow. Okay, so that will help a lot. I mean, even if it's just what can you glean from the voters pamphlet, it would be helpful.
And on that topic, since it's such a pertinent topic to us, having to do specifically with our elections, it's also a really pertinent topic to what we talked about this evening. And I, for example, am interested in how do other countries handle this? I mean, other countries have the same sorts of issues. We may not think about what to do in Multnomah County, but what do they do in Sweden? I mean, just interested in ideas on what is sort of reparations.
On the reparations topic?
Well, I just was
Yeah,
being a
on
little
any
bit
topic,
facetious,
you
but
always
it's,
have that.
yeah, there's a lot of overlap there, I
And
think.
what is homelessness around the world, you know? Different in different places. It seems like it's very hard on people here in this country. You know,
Yeah. Okay, well, that, I think that gets us a start for next week. Just feel free to send in your thoughts and ideas. If we get a little bit of discussion and activity going before next Monday, then we really hit the ground running at 7 o'clock next Monday. And with that, I will thank you all for coming
Okay.
and yield the
you.
rest of
I
my
will
time.
put these, I'll put all three of these recordings up on the, well, they'll be on the Southminster YouTube channel, but I'll also make a note of them on the Southminster Connections group on Facebook. And I guess I could also send it to Dan and he could email it out to anybody who's expressed interest in case some of you don't have Facebook accounts. I'm running into more and more people who don't have Facebook accounts and don't want them, so.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, well, it's fine. It's fine, but we do have a good Facebook group as just a posting board. But I could also give the links to Lisa and she can email them out with the weekly, email too. So I'll try and get on that.
Okay, I wrote down everybody who's here tonight. If there's anybody I won't be able to get an email address from the directory, then you may have to email me, but
Good.
I think I can find you all.
We're all on it.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you all and good night.
thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Marilyn, I responded to your email. You can see my response.
Okay, cool. Thank
Thank
you.
you for
Later.
setting that
Bye-bye.
up, Betty.